This is the tale of two young people who, following the burial for their mother, discovered an enigmatic door. They were shocked by what they saw as soon as they stepped inside. Welcome to USA Stories channel. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell button to receive all new updates. Now let's go to the story. In Houston, Texas, Henry Wilson and his spouse Laura resided in a modest home. The couple kept their previous painful memories to themselves and had a quiet existence. Those who encountered them in the city sympathized with them. However, why? Henry had to use a wheelchair to get about since he was without legs. Many thought that he had been in a vehicle accident many years ago while working as a driver and had lost both of his legs. But the one who garnered more public notice was his wife. The woman's complete face was constantly hidden by a face mask that she wore. Rumors circulated across the city over her facial deformities. Still, very few people truly realized the true nature of her years-ago ordeal. Her husband and she reared their two children, who were born 3 years apart, with love and affection despite the fact that they were not like their neighbors. In their 40s, the couple gave birth to their daughter Amy, and a few years later, their young son Joe was born. They made sure their children had all they needed and loved them. 10 years passed. Amy and Joe were both doing academically well. Even though their parents loved them, the two felt a bit apart from them. Although Amy found it uncomfortable to watch her father in a wheelchair, she was more humiliated by her mother's long-wearing face mask. "Why do you wear a mask every day, Mom? I hear my students utter horrible things when they question me about it." One chilly evening, the small girl added, "They also ask me why Dad looks like a grandpa," without realizing that her words had broken her parents' hearts. Laura, who was now on the verge of tears, looked at her husband somberly and said, "Sweetheart, your friends need to pay more attention to their studies than to what other people's parents look like, okay?" The lady lacked the fortitude to tell her children what had occurred to them all those years ago at that very time. Sadly, their children grew farther away from them every day. After several years, Amy was getting ready to graduate from high school and enroll in college. She refused to let her parents bring her to the college, though. "Mom, Dad, could you just not come to college with me? And please give me a call in advance if you two want to visit me," the young girl replied. Henry and his wife were shocked by what their daughter said, but they also sensed that she was embarrassed of them. The girl was actually concerned because she didn't want her college classmates to visit her parents, who were physically challenged. After a few weeks, Amy moved out of her parents' house and off to college without saying goodbye the right way. Joe, her younger brother, followed in her footsteps 3 years later. Once the little child was accepted into the university, he moved out of his parents' home. It was only Henry and his wife at home, and it was getting harder for them to take care of the house and themselves. Unfortunately, their children's weekend visits halted, making things more difficult for them. The pair thus experienced depression, which caused the Wilson family to suffer a significant loss. You see, Henry's health was never the same after his terrible tragedy due to the damage he sustained. The father tried his hardest to live as long as he could, but he was unable to cope with the idea of his kids being without him. He sadly died after suffering from illness for several weeks. Laura contacted her kids, broken-hearted and crying, to break the terrible news. She was shocked by their answer, though. "But Mom, you can definitely manage the funeral by yourself. In addition to other issues, my examinations are in a few weeks." Amy said, "You can ask Mrs. Grace, the neighbor, to help you," without stuttering. Laura longed to say something, anything, but her cold-blooded daughter had already hung up. The woman started crying uncontrollably at this time. She reflected on the life she and her spouse had committed to raising their kids. Sadly, their love and kindness went unappreciated. She took up her phone and gave Joe a call once she managed to gather herself. Laura knew the young man was never going home, even though he said he was very busy and would return as soon as he resolved his issues. The distraught widow was left to bury her spouse by herself. Laura lost a lot of weight a few weeks after her husband's death because she was unable to let go of him. She would look at the photos every day, reminiscing about their happy days together. She was deeply saddened by this, and over time, her health declined. Sadly, she passed away from sadness and despair 2 years later. Amy and Joe did not go to their mother's funeral when she passed away. Instead, They gave Mrs. Grace, the late mother's friend and neighbor, charge of the funeral. Laura was buried donning the mask that she had worn for a long time. Nobody who was at the burial even dared to remove it, but they denounced her kids' terrible actions. 5 months later, Amy and her younger brother went back to live with their parents. The family home would be sold, they had determined. Mrs. Grace gave them the keys and they entered the building to tidy it up and remove everything. It was a lot of effort, but they never seemed to mind. In addition, they were ecstatic about the proceeds from the sale of the property, but they had no idea that they were going to have a surprise. They discovered a door they had never noticed before when shifting the wardrobe in the basement. They were both taken aback. There were locks on the door, so Joe had to pry it open. When they turned on the light after entering the hidden path, they discovered an ancient brown cardboard box coated with cobwebs. Amy opened it without thinking twice, but she was shocked by what she saw. Amy found an old newspaper and a gold medal that had been given to their mother. She went through it, handed it to Joe, and began to sob silently. Many years ago, the newspaper reported about their mother's brave act. Laura, a teenage medical student, put out a fire that started in a fatal vehicle accident, saving the lives of 4 people. Young Henry Wilson was driving the car when it lost control at high speed and collided with a truck. Sadly, there was damage to the fuel tank, which resulted in the automobile catching fire. Laura was in the car with the other passengers on that awful day. She did, however, recover consciousness before the others and quickly managed to extricate them from the flaming automobile. She began doing back-and-forth movements to save everyone inside the car. Henry's leg was trapped in the automobile after the collision, so she was unable to do anything that night. Thankfully, Laura was able to free him and the other occupants from the flaming car with the assistance of onlookers who had come on the scene. The courageous girl was rescuing lives, but she was unaware that the fire had severely injured her lovely face. For her brave actions, little Laura was awarded a medal, and her name appeared in all of the local newspapers. But after that sad day, she was never the same. She would always have to wear the mask over her disfigured face. She left college as a result, moving to a new place where no one knew who she was. She led a calm life there and began working as a nurse at a hospital. A young man in a wheelchair was waiting at her home one sunny morning. It turned out to be Henry, who in that terrible tragedy had lost both of his legs. He informed her that ever since the event, he had been looking for her. After a few months of their reunion, Henry proposed to her. After being married, they remained in love till the end. When Amy and Joe learned about their parents' tragic past, they were unable to stop sobbing. They gave Mrs. Grace the home key that day and requested her to drive them to their parents' burial. They pleaded for their pardon there. They had never known the atrocities their parents had endured, so they had always felt embarrassed of them. The 2 young adults ultimately made the decision not to sell their parents' home. Instead, they fixed it. Years later, when they told their children about the extraordinary history of their grandparents, their children grew up to admire Laura and Henry, in contrast to them. What lessons have you taken away from this family tale then? Post your ideas in the comments section. Till we meet again, be careful. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos. If you enjoyed the tale, the next video that plays on your screen will probably move you too.